evening, everyone. Welcome to today's second public information session on the BECOL hydroelectric scheme facilities on the Macal River. I am Jorge Franco, Environmental Officer at the Department of the Environment, and I'll be moderating today's session. These sessions used to be held in persons in the various communities along the Macal River. However, due to the COVID safeguard measures, we have now moved forward to having these sessions virtually. And based on popular demand, we are now having this second public information session for 2021 on prime time at 7 p.m. So, thanks everyone for your comments. And as we move forward to try to improve, we used to have these activities mid-afternoon. So we're hoping that more people can engage and we have a more interactive sessions, particularly with our communities along the Macal River. And Brother Blaze and everyone who is listening into today's public information session. This public information session is being streamed live on the Department of the Environment Facebook, as well as the Press Office Facebook accounts. And it's being streamed live on the Press Office YouTube platform. So if you know anyone who is interested, who has YouTube, Facebook, please take the opportunity to share the link with them and have them participate actively tonight as we bring to you into your homes, into your cars, into your office, wherever you are, today's second public information session, where we will share information and inform the general public on environmental issues and environmental reporting requirements of BECOL under the environmental compliance plan that they have in agreement with the Department of the Environment. Now, this environmental compliance plan mandates that BECOL undertakes these sessions on a quarterly basis. And it also has terms and conditions where reporting requirements are to be conducted by BECOL. And tonight, BECOL will be providing some of the reporting information that they have. So tonight, I'd just like to highlight that the information that we will be sharing with the general will be on the water quality for the second quarter of 2021, that is up to ending of June. And we also be reporting on the emergency preparedness. We all know that we're in a hurricane season, so it's very important and it's a requirement that BECOL updates its emergency preparedness plan annually and well in advance of the hurricane season. So they will be sharing with us what they have in place and what are some of the updates that they have and activities that they have been doing. In addition, they will be reporting on the Mercury-in-fish survey that is conducted on an annual basis. And as we all know, BECOL is currently engaging in doing this activity for 2021. The environmental compliance plan with BECOL also has several other reporting requirements. For example, wildlife assessment, sediment buildups. These are time bound, and as soon as these assessments are completed and information is available, we will also be bringing these information to the awareness of the general public so that then they are informed and they can take necessary precaution measures where necessary, and they will be duly advised by both BECOL, the Department of the Environment, NEMO, Ministry of Health, where it's relevant and pertinent. I'd like to mention that before we continue and we go into the presentations, that tonight, unfortunately, we won't have access to our WhatsApp accounts, but nonetheless, I'd like to mention that your questions, your comments, we would ask for you to please use the comment box on the DOE Facebook account and that of the press office account. We'd like for you to please, in making your questions, if you could highlight from which of the 5 communities along the Macal River you are from, or from wherever community you are participating from, just indicate for us so that we have a general idea as to who we need to reach out and who has been actively participating so that we can have and improve our engagement with the relevant communities. These communities I'm referring to San Ignacio, Cristo Rey, Cala Creek, Santa Familia, Bully Tree. So the sessions is specifically targeted at those communities, but again, we know in a virtual session, so we've gone international, national, international, so we welcome comments from each and every person. Just highlight from where you're sending in your comments. So again, use the comment box and we will be recording your questions. We will we'll address all questions and answers subsequent to having the presentations being conducted by BECOL on the 3 thematic areas. Again, water quality, emergency preparedness, and Mercury-in-fish. With no further delay, I'd like to introduce our BECOL representative tonight. This is Mr. Oscar Alonso. He's a Health, Safety, and Environmental Officer for BECOL. Mr. Alonso, I now hand over to you to update the general public on the reporting information and updated information that BECOL has in regards to the compliance with the department's environmental compliance plan. Mr. Alonso?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Franco, for that introduction. So, as you said, without any further delay, we'll jump into our presentation. Just allow me a couple seconds to share my screen. Okay. All right. So, as Mr. Franco mentioned, now these public sessions used to be held physically in person in the various vulnerable communities, including San Ignacio Town and Santa Elena Town, as well as some of the villages downstream of BECOL's facilities, right? However, since the pandemic restrictions and all, we had to move to a virtual platform, which I think was a blessing in disguise. I think it allowed us to reach a wider audience, and we've had much more participation, much better participation, more interactive, more questions coming up. So that's really good, since the information we have to present, we believe is very important for the public to know. So without any further delay, then let's get into it. Since we're reaching a much wider national audience, or maybe even international, we'll do a little background summary of what BECOL is all about for those that may not live in the Cayo area, may not be necessarily familiar with BECOL's operations. BECOL operates 3 hydroelectric facilities, all of them located on the Macal River in the Cayo district. Mountain Pine Ridge, where we have the one furthest upstream, which is the Chalillo facility, which is then followed by MoHW, and then Vaca, which is the last in the series of the hydroelectric facilities. In terms of when they were built and commissioned, MoHW is actually the oldest facility. It was built and commissioned in 1995. This was then followed by Chalillo, which was commissioned in 2005. Chalillo was basically built to ensure that that MoHW and the subsequent Vaca facility came online in 2010, that they would have enough water throughout the year, both in the rainy and dry season, to be able to operate and deliver power to the country of Belize. Right. So Chalillo, in terms of size, reservoir size, is the largest. Our relative location within the country of Belize is we're located in the Cayo district. As I mentioned before, the Chalillo Dam is actually in the Mountain Pine Ridge area, and MoHW and Vaca are in roughly in the Vaca Plateau area of the Cayo district, right? And they're situated a few miles apart along the river. They're not very far apart. So the same water that flows into the Chalillo, or through the Chalillo Dam, then flows down to MoHW and subsequently down to Vaca. Thereby, the same amount of water is generating power at all 3 facilities. This is an aerial view of our Chalillo facility in the rainy season a couple of years ago. And so you can see the spillway is active. The spillway is a structure designed into the dam to allow it to overflow smoothly when it has reached its carrying capacity. right? Of course, the dam and the reservoir, like anything else, has a certain limit to its capacity. And when that limit is reached, the water must overflow and continue flowing downstream. So that's what you're seeing here, the spillway becoming active. It's a natural overflow. It's nothing to be concerned about. There's no gates to be opened on the dam. It's just a cement spillway structure that allows the water to flow over once it has reached the maximum capacity of the reservoir. All right, so as I mentioned, the water from the Chaleo reservoir, it generates it generates power at Chaleo. However, the main purpose of Chaleo is to store water for the other two facilities. However, we are able to generate 7 megawatts at Chaleo. This water then flows down to MoHW, which is what we would like to call the workhorse of the three facilities. It generates up to 25.2 megawatts. And from there, the same water then flows on down to Vaca, which generates 19 megawatts of power. So combined between all three, we generate roughly about 52 megawatts, which equates to about 40 to 45% of the power demand of the entire country of Belize. Right? If you look at the figures on the screen, the Chaleo reservoir is roughly about 2,500 surface acres. So it's far bigger than the Vaca reservoir, which is 170 acres, and MoHW, which is 30 acres in size, roughly. All right? And this, of course, translates into, in terms of water storage, we can see the difference between the three facilities. So just some very basic information on how the inner workings of a hydroelectric plant. The water is stored in the reservoir so that then it can be used in the future in a controlled manner. Water is allowed into the powerhouse via a control gate, which is opened. This is basically the inlet, what we call the inlet in layman's terms. It goes through through a tunnel referred to as a penstock in the industry. The penstock takes the water into the powerhouse, which is usually located a few hundred meters downstream of the dam, except in the case of MoHW, which is a run-of-the-river facility. The dam and the powerhouse are located about 2.5 miles away from each other. Chaleo and Vaca are designed a bit different. The powerhouse is just a few hundred meters downstream. So when the water enters the powerhouse, it turns, it basically spins a turbine, which in turn turns an electrical generator, which actually generates the electricity. This is then pushed out to a substation, which is on site, and from there, the voltage is stepped up and it is sent out to the Contiki substation just outside of San Ignacio. All right, so taking a little bit more closer look at how the turbine operates, right? The water basically flows in to the lower part of the turbine where there are some kind of like a propeller blade design. So the water hits the blades, it spins the turbine shaft then spins the electrical generator located above, and that's how we produce the electricity. All right, so if some of the older viewers may recall a couple of decades ago when we used to have blackouts in Belize were very frequent, right? And sometimes it would be extended for hours, even days, right? So Belize had to find a solution in terms of coming up with an option for dependable electrical power supply, right? The government at the time then looked into the benefits of hydropower, the feasibility of doing hydro in Belize. The engineering studies were done, and it was decided that this particular area on the Macal River had a very high potential for to generate electricity using hydroelectric power. Some of the benefits then is that hydropower is, compared to fossil fuels, are very clean. It's a very clean form of power. It's dependable. As long as there's water in the Macal River, we'll always be able to generate power. And of course, it's renewable, right? We don't expect the Macal River to dry up anytime soon. So we should have a renewable energy for decades, even centuries to come, right? We don't require any fuel, so we're not dependent on external supplies of gasoline or diesel, and this in turn then also provides the benefit that the cost of that power remains stable, since we don't depend on the fluctuating price of fossil fuels. Since we aren't burning anything, there's no air pollution produced. So the hydropower is very clean when it comes to air pollution. There's basically no chemical smoke being produced from our operations. As I mentioned before, it provides us a measure of energy independence, since we are now able to generate in country up to, in some at times during the year, up to 45% of the energy needs of the entire country of Belize, right? And it's a stable and consistent energy. The dams also have some spin-off effects. The structures themselves act as flood reduction structures on the river. They're able to capture and slow down some of the flood waters that are coming down from the higher elevations of the mountain pine ridge. And by virtue of having the structures on the river and having water level monitoring devices on the river and along in our area of operations, we are able to provide an advance warning of any flood waters that may be heading downstream during natural storm and flooding events, right? So as Mr. Franco mentioned, in order for BECOL to be able to have constructed and be able to continue operating the hydroelectric facilities, we had to sign an environmental compliance plan with the government of Belize, which is basically a contractual agreement to the government as to where the government lays out to BECOL what are the requirements for BECOL to be able to operate, right? And for the purpose of this is to ensure that our operations have the least negative impacts both on the environment as well as on the health and well-being of the general public downstream of our operations, or anywhere within our sphere of operations, right? So some of the requirements, the ECP is a very lengthy and detailed document. The government of Belize and the DOE did a very good job of putting together this document to ensure to ensure that things are being done the right way, right? So some of the requirements are that we have to monitor the quality of the Macal River, and this is done on a quarterly basis. Samples are taken from the river and sent for analysis. We analyze key parameters that would indicate are key indicators of the health of the Macal River, and we'll get into that into a lot more detail shortly. Mercury testing, we take samples of the fishes from the Macal River on an annual basis, once a year, and we send the fish tissue for testing to determine what is the level of mercury within the fish tissue, right? Mercury is an issue associated with most hydroelectric facilities anywhere in the world, right? It happens when an area is flooded, which would be the reservoir area, and if there's still any residual vegetation left after the area has been cleared out, because of course before we flood the reservoir area, we try to clear out as much vegetation as possible to prevent exactly this mercury issue, or at least to mitigate it, right? So however, there's always some residual vegetation that will be left behind, and as these vegetation decompose, the mercury is released into the water column, and so the levels then become higher than what we would call normal background levels, right? And the fish then ingest this, and it becomes it starts to bioaccumulate, because mercury is the nature of mercury is that our human bodies as well as the systems of animals, they metabolize mercury very slowly, so it tends to bioaccumulate, and when it reaches a certain level within your body, it can cause physiological and neurological effects, right? So we have to keep actively monitoring the levels of mercury in the fish in order to be able to advise the public what are the safe levels of consumption when it comes to fish from the Macal River, right? emergency preparedness. By virtue of the dams being on the river, we have to be prepared for a possible emergency at any one of the dams, right? While the proper engineering and studies went into constructing the dams and they're not expected to fail anytime, we still have to be prepared in the event that something unexpected would happen, or maybe some act of nature would cause damage to any of our facilities. Then we might have an emergency on our hands, and we have to have a plan in place to be able to mitigate any negative effects, right? So we'll look at what are our what safeguards we have in place, and what are the procedures to be followed in the event of an emergency. As Mr. Franco mentioned, the ECP also requires that that BECOL keeps the public informed on a regular basis. So we hold these public information sessions quarterly. Every 3 months roughly, we reach out to the public and disseminate any updates on information that we may have. We also must do sediment assessments to determine what is the level of sediment that may be building up behind the dams, which could possibly compromise the integrity of the structures on the river. So we have to look at that buildup of sediment. And another major requirement is that while we have a physical structure blocking the natural flow of water on the Macal River, we must have mechanisms in place to ensure that basically that the river doesn't dry out downstream of the dams, right? So as long as we're generating power, water will always be flowing. But of course, as with anything else, the turbines, the equipment, the machinery requires maintenance. And when we do have to have one or more of our turbines in any of our facilities down for maintenance or repairs, then there must be some other way to allow the water to flow downstream. So both the Chaleo and the Vaca Dams are designed with what we call an environmental valve, which allows water to flow through the dam and keep water flowing in the river whenever we are not able to generate power at that particular facility. Right. So these are just some of the requirements of the ECP. Like I said, it's a lengthy document. It speaks to all manner of things regarding environmental compliance, as well as health and safety issues with respect to not only our employees, but the general public, right? We must also, the ECP also requires that we take public safety very seriously, and we have things in place to be able to ensure that the health and well-being of the public is not being compromised in any way by our operations. Right. So if we get into it, let's get into the water quality monitoring. So like I mentioned, 4 times a year, we go out and collect samples. This activity is actually subcontracted to the Coastal Zone Management Authority and Institute. They're the organization that is currently doing this water quality monitoring for us. So we have, I think, between 20 and 30 sampling points from the Chaleo Dam all the way down to San Ignacio Town. Right. What you're seeing on the screen right now is the Chaleo area. We take samples from all the way upstream on the furthest reaches of the Raspaculo tributary, as well as the Macal tributary, that they basically then they merge at a point at the beginning of the Chaleo reservoir. So we try to take samples, or we take samples upstream of the reservoir to basically establish a baseline. And then we take another set of samples within the Chaleo reservoir. And then we take samples downstream of the Chaleo facility as well, just downstream in what we call the tail race area, which is a man-made canal where the water flows down after exiting the powerhouse. And we also take a sample near Guacamaya Bridge, for those of you that are familiar with that area. All right. Again, the water then flows down to MoHW. So we take samples from the MoHW reservoir as well. The MoHW reservoir is much smaller than the Chaleo reservoir, so there's only about 3 sample points on that reservoir. Downstream of MoHW, we also take samples on the Vaca reservoir as well, and downstream of Vaca reservoir. And then, as I mentioned, We also take in a couple of downstream populated areas. One of them is near Cristo Rey village, and the other one is, of course, at San Ignacio town. So we try to take samples, running the full gambit of the water flow, beginning from the Chaleo area all the way down to San Ignacio, which is the nearest major population center. Right, so we are still awaiting our analytical report for the first quarter of this year, but we have the results from last year, from 2020, which basically, it's a very lengthy report. There's a lot of data that feeds into these reports, so we try as much as possible to compress that information for the purposes of presenting to the public, to compress it in a manner that is more easily understandable and relatable to the general public, right? So, and when looking at this data, I mean, you know, we have technical people looking at the data. We send it to the DOE for them to also analyze. But in terms of the general public, I think what the public really wants to know is the water safe or not? Is it safe for me to bathe in the water? Is it safe for me to extract water from the river to use for domestic purposes like washing, maybe even cooking? Is it safe for me for my pet to go into the water, use the water, drink the water? Right? Is it safe for my kids to be in the river, swimming and recreating in the river? Right? I think those are the pertinent questions for the public, right? What they really want to know. So in general, to summarize what the data from 2020 showed is that the Macal River Basin, including the area where the hydroelectric facilities are and downstream, is basically in an overall healthy condition, right? We have not seen any major long-term effects on the river, and we try to, when we're looking at this data, when we're collecting samples and putting the data together, we're looking more for long-term effects, right? When it comes to water and these these ecological services, they can be very, short-term effects can be very intense, right? But very short-lived, right? So for example, when you have a flood, when you have a tropical storm passing through on a flood, under flooding conditions, the turbidity of the water, the clarity of the water will be very bad. It'll be the turbidity will be very high, basically, right? Water looks like chocolate milk, pretty much, right? So for that short period of time of a few days, maybe a week or a week and a half, maybe even 2 weeks, the quality of that water in the river will not be to a level where, you know, you want to be recreating in the river or using the river to wash and so on, because you have a lot of suspended sediment and so on because of the flooding conditions, right? But that's very short-lived. That will eventually clear up within a few days. So what we look at is more the long-term effects. Are the dams and the hydroelectric facilities causing long-term changes in the overall condition of the Macal River, right? So that's what we're referring to when we're saying that the river is in an overall healthy condition, is that while the dam has not we can't say that the dam hasn't had any effect at all. In terms of major long-term effects, we're not seeing any that would really be a cause for concern when it comes to the environment or the health and well-being of the populations downstream, right? So as I said, when it comes to short-term effects, every time we do a sampling, a round of sampling, we will see some parameters will be high, some will be low, and they'll fluctuate like this, right? But what we look at is we try to look at the data, all the historical data on a long-term basis, and see what the general trend is looking like, right? So as I mentioned, how can the dam activity affect you? So in general, the water from the Macal River is funneled using the dams and directed to the power stations, which then produce electricity, right? After the water basically flows into the powerhouse and passes through, there's really no chemical alteration done to the water at that point. It's more so of physical action that's taking place in terms of the water pushing the turbines. But however, this direct interaction, there is a potential that some physical and chemical changes may occur to the water at that point, right? So this is why we have to keep monitoring, even though we expect that it will be very minimal. We have to keep monitoring and gathering the data in order to be able to look at the effects on a long-term basis, right? So what do we do, or what do we do when we go out and look at the health of the Macal River, right? As I mentioned before, we do collect physical samples, but we also collect information on site. Some parameters we have to measure on site because, for instance, temperature, right? We have to measure it there and then. Otherwise, if we collect it and measure it later, that won't be an accurate reflection of the temperature, right? Similar to the pH. The pH could change depending how long you're holding a sample. Oxygen will dissolve out or dissolve in depending on the temperature, changes in temperature of the water, right? So some of these things are measured on site, right? Temperature, dissolved oxygen. Dissolved oxygen is one of the key indicators of the health of a water column. Just like us, the organisms that are living within that water column use oxygen for their biological processes. The fish, they breathe the water. They breathe the oxygen in the water. That's a little bit different fashion than us, but they still use the oxygen to keep themselves alive. The plants as well, oxygen plays a role in their biological functions, the algae, the different water vegetation, right? pH, we have to measure this on site, and this is basically a measure of how acid or basic the water is. Turbidity, as I mentioned before, is looking at how clear the water is, how easily you can see through the column of water. As I mentioned before, during flooding, for example, you have a lot of suspended solids, sediments would be suspended in the water, which would then make it, would increase the turbidity and thereby reducing the amount of sunlight that can actually penetrate through the water column, right? Conductivity, which measures the ability of the water to conduct an electrical current. And this also tells you a lot about what types of elements are dissolved within that water column, right? It's the actual elements that are dissolved in the water that have an electrical charge and would determine what is the conductivity of the water. Salinity, of course, the water in the Macal River should be fresh, right? There shouldn't be any saltwater intrusion or any mechanism by where the water the salinity of the water is increasing, right? The water should always be fresh. Total dissolved solids is measured on site as well. So apart from those, then the consultants collect physical samples in bottles, which they then send to an approved lab for testing. And some of the things we test are biological oxygen demand, which measures the amount of oxygen which is required by organisms within that water column in order to break down organic material. Chemical oxygen demand, which is it's similar to biological oxygen demand, except that it doesn't measure the activity of organisms in the water. It simply measures the reactions of different chemicals or elements within the water column and how those reactions deplete the oxygen supply or the oxygen content of that column of water. Total suspended solids, it's a bit like turbidity, except it's measured by a physical process as opposed to a probe that's inserted into the water. So it kind of gives you a bit more accurate picture of how much solids are actually suspended within that water column. We also look at bacteria, total coliform bacteria, which are one of the most common types of bacteria present in the environment. And these can come from both human sources as well as animal sources as well, right? So while it's useful in terms of determining the overall amount of bacteria present in a water column or a particular sample, it's not specific enough to tell us if it's coming from human or animal activity. E. coli now is a specific type of bacteria that is is a better indicator of human activity, right? It can also come from other warm-blooded animals, but it's a better indicator of if the water is being contaminated by human activity. So we try to look at E. coli and try to closely monitor the levels of E. coli and determine what it is saying in terms of the health of that water system. We'll also look at inorganic compounds, and some of the more important ones are nitrates and phosphates, since this could, an increase in these particular elements or compounds could lead to eutrophication, which is where there's an explosive growth of algae on the water. And then, of course, anything that, as with anything else, right, the algae would grow explosively, and then it has to die. When it dies, that decomposition process takes over and tends to suck the oxygen right out of the water column as well. So we have to keep a close eye on things like nitrates and phosphates as well, in order to, we don't want to fall into a situation where the water is becoming eutrophic, or it's becoming too rich, basically, right? It has too many nutrients, so it would allow algae and other aquatic plants and so on to overgrow, pretty much, right? What were the findings? As I mentioned before, the long and short of it is that there's no reason to really be concerned about the quality of the water in the Macal River. It can safely be used for recreation, even for domestic activities, right, like washing and so on. Nothing that we have measured so far, any of the parameters that we've been looking at over the past 15 years or so, is indicating that there's any major long-term change happening, negative change happening to the water in the Macal River, right? If you look more specifically at things like nitrate and phosphate, the concentrations for the December or Q4 of 2020 were a little bit higher, or a bit higher throughout the Macal River in comparison to the previous sample periods for that same year, which was in June, August, and October. However, this could be attributed to some intense rainfall that we had in November last year, and the subsequent flooding. This would have caused some runoff into the river, and runoff always brings with it things like, specifically things like nitrate and phosphate, right? Nitrate and phosphate, as some of you may know, can also be found in things like fertilizers and other chemicals and so on, detergents that we use, right? To wash and so on. These can all eventually end up in the river, particularly during intense rainfall and flooding events, right? So we would expect that these particular compounds would be higher during flooding events, which is not necessarily associated with the activities of the hydroelectric facilities, right? Again, bacteria in December 2020. They were low overall throughout the Macal River. There was one site in the MoHW reservoir where the E. coli levels were above what we call the safe level, or the upper limit of 200 colony forming units. However, this was basically an outlier, as all the other points registered very low levels of E. coli and total coliform. And in the overall scheme of things, it did not influence the average for the system as a whole, right? So what that basically is saying is that while we had one point that had high E. coli levels, that did not affect the quality of the water in terms of making it unsafe to use by the general public, right? Or even for ecological purposes, right? So, like I mentioned before, the data that's collected, it's a huge volume of data, and it's not something that we can present at a forum like this in terms of presenting the raw data and the raw reports. So we try to compress it and present a condensed version of it, to give the general public a general idea of what the quality of the water is in the Macal River, right? So if you look at the key in the brown box at the top, It gives you some definitions for what are the units of measurement. And on the right-hand side of that box, it shows you three letters here, S, I, and D, right? S means that that particular parameter is stable, meaning that over the course of sampling over the past years, that particular parameter has not changed much. It has basically remained stable over the years. I means that it has a general increasing trend. When you look at the trend, the long-term trend, if it has an I next to it, that means that it has been increasing. It doesn't really speak to the magnitude of the increase, but it just generally says that the general trend is that it's increasing, and D, of course, is for decreasing, right? So in general, the average levels for most of the parameters measured at the Chaleo Dam, this is specifically speaking to the Chaleo Dam area, the reservoir and upstream areas, and just immediately downstream. These were within the normal range of what we call a normal river ecosystem, except for the dissolved oxygen. If you see the dissolved oxygen, the range is supposed to be between 6 and 8. If you look at the blue box on the bottom right hand, the dissolved oxygen, DO, is supposed to be within 6 to 8 parts per million. When it was measured on that particular day, it was at 5.05, which is slightly below 6. It's not yet at a point where it would be detrimental to fish in the water column, but it's at a 5. Then would raise a little red flag and say we need to monitor this, right? Ensure that there's nothing, not any underlying issue that is causing the dissolved oxygen to start to reduce, right? So that was the only parameter that stood out basically in the Chaleo area. Wasn't much of a concern. It is just below 6, and 5 is still a relatively healthy level of dissolved oxygen, right? Everything else was normal. The nitrate, the phosphate, temperature, the pH, the salinity was normal. The bacterial levels were normal. So there's no cause for concern otherwise. For the MoHW Dam area, again, most of them were normal. Most of the parameters were normal, meaning that there's no, there are no negative effects being caused to the water quality at that for that particular sampling period. The dissolved oxygen again stood out, but this time because it was higher than the upper limit of 8, which is not a bad thing, right? Oxygen is used by the organisms living within that water column for the different biological processes. So generally for dissolved oxygen, the more is usually better, right? So as mentioned before, everything else was normal. Bacteria, nitrate, phosphate, nutrients, pH, temperature, everything else was more or less normal for the sampling period. Looking at the Vaca Dam area, similar situation, right? Everything else normal except for DO being slightly above 8. But as mentioned before, when it comes to oxygen, more is usually better. So overall, the water in the Vaca Dam area, and remember, the Vaca Dam is the last dam in the series just before the water continues flowing downstream to Cristo Rey and San Ignacio and other populated areas downstream, right? So I think we would want to keep a little closer eye on the Vaca Dam area, since it's pretty much the outlet before the water keeps flowing on downstream, right? And what this is saying is that the water from the Vaca Dam area before and after the dam is within the range of a normal environmental system, and at this time presents no risk to any organisms in the areas at the Vaca Dam or downstream, right? So when you look at the downstream areas, you're looking at Cristo Rey village, and more importantly, San Ignacio, since San Ignacio is a major population center. I think it's the second largest municipality in Belize. So naturally, we would expect that there is some that the human activity might be affecting the water quality in this area, right? So we look at it to determine, well, primarily to see if the dams are causing any effect, but it also serves as useful information to see if the town itself may or may not be having an effect on the water in that area, right? But the results of the fourth quarter data of 2020 suggest that the Macal River downstream areas are still within range of a healthy riverine ecosystem, right? And despite periods of rains during when the samples were taken, all the parameters were within limits of what we would call a healthy system, right? Even the bacterial loading was normal for this period. So this indicates that when it comes health-wise, when it comes to human health, the water is safe for recreational use, right? All right, so moving on then, and I think as questions come up, I think you can forward those or have them in the comment section, and we will address those questions after the presentation. So we'll move on then to our dam emergency preparedness procedures, right? So before we get into our emergency procedures, right? Because whenever you have to activate your emergency procedures means that something has gone wrong already, right? So the purpose at BECOL, or what we strive to do, is not to reach to that point, right? We don't want to reach to that point that we have to activate our emergency plan. Once we're at that point, then things may not be looking too good. So we implement a lot of we do a lot of things to ensure that we don't have a dam emergency that may affect communities downstream, right? So some of these is that we do physical inspections of the dam on a weekly basis, right? Our dam safety officer goes out, actually does visual inspections of the dam structure itself and the surrounding terrain. We look at if there's any water springs or water leaks springing up, either through the concrete structure or channeling under or around the concrete, or the area between where the concrete joins the natural soil or the natural hillsides, right? We scan these areas, scrutinize these areas in detail to ensure that we don't have any channeling of water that could compromise the integrity of the dam. We have things like joint monitors installed on the dam itself at strategic locations, and what these joint monitors do is that they can detect any shifts in the dam structure itself to within to less than a millimeter of movement, right? So the dam safety officer goes out with a special instrument. He measures the joint monitors to see if there was any shift within the last few couple of weeks. Of course, you have not had any measurable shifts to date, which we don't expect to ever have any shift, right? But all the same, we do our due diligence and we take our measurements and we ensure that if there's any shift, that we catch it early, and so we can take mitigative measures then to ensure that this doesn't then develop into a full-scale emergency, right? Within the control rooms of the powerhouse, the operators also monitor instrumentations that are installed within the structure of the dam itself, right? We have piezometers installed which basically measure the pressure of the water within the structure of the dam and underneath its foundation, right? If the water starts to seep underneath the foundation and the pressure gets high, it can have the effect of basically floating the dam, right? And of course, that would be a very, very bad thing. That would then put us in a situation where the dam the integrity of the dam would be compromised. The dam could even topple over, right? So, but we have these instruments that are taking measurements continuously, 24/7. They're taking measurements, and we were able to view this data that the instruments are collecting on a real-time basis, right? We have a data logger system set up so that our dam safety officer as well as our technicians and supervisors in the company are able to view this data at any time from anywhere, whether we're at the dams or whether we're out here in San Ignacio, we're able to see this data and in real time, and if there's any spikes in the pressure, then we'll be able to deal with that and put in place mitigative measures to ensure that we don't have a dam failure. Right? We monitor the penstock pressure continuously. The penstock is again, like I mentioned before, it's a tube that, basically a tube, a pipe that brings water from the reservoir to the powerhouse. We look at water levels, especially during storm events, right? We would keep a close eye on the water levels. We keep a close eye on our spillway structures to ensure that the water levels are not going higher than what the dam was designed for, right? And if it does, then we have, there are certain measures we can take to reduce the level of the water behind the dam. All right, so basically, we have mechanisms in place whereby dam failure would not catch us by surprise. It would be almost impossible for a dam failure or a dam emergency to catch us by surprise, right? If there's anything building up, we would be alerted to it far ahead of time, and we'd be able to take measures such as bringing down the level of water in the reservoir and other mitigative measures to ensure that it doesn't develop into a full-scale emergency that could threaten lives and property downstream, right? However, as mentioned, with all these safeguards in place, there's no telling, things can happen unexpectedly, right? We can get a storm of the century. There could be a very powerful earthquake in one of our neighboring countries that would then send strong tremors our way, which could also affect the integrity of the dam if it's, the tremors are strong enough. The dams are built to withstand tremors that we would expect, worst case scenario in Belize, right? So to date, with all the aftershocks and the tremors that we've felt in Belize, it has not ever had any effect on any of the dam structures themselves, right? And we do have procedures as well that we follow whenever there's an earthquake reported nearby, and whether or not we feel the tremors, we do activate these procedures, and we do some special checks at that time to ensure that the dams are still intact and there's no threat to the integrity of the structures. Right. So, however, if we do ever reach the stage where a full-scale emergency is developing, we have an early warning system installed along the downstream areas. Basically, what this system consists of is it's 7 sirens, and these are installed in what we call or refer to as the vulnerable communities, the vulnerable areas downstream, and these are villages of Cristo Rey, Cala Creek, Bullet Tree, Santa Familia, of course, San Ignacio, Santa Elena towns. And we also have a siren at Char Creek Resort and one at Black Rock Resort as well. Right, since these are along, these are also in the downstream areas, and at any one time there may be tourists and Belizean personnel working at these facilities that would need to be alerted as well. Right, BECOL is right now looking at upgrading this EWS system in order to make it more far-reaching and make it more effective should we ever have to call it into action. Right, so yeah, 7 sirens are remotely connected via VHF radio signal. There's a master trigger at the MoHW facility control room. So basically, if there's any, and the MoHW facility is the hub for operations, right? All communications must pass through the MoHW facility and be relayed through the MoHW facility. So if there's any emergency situation developing at Chaleo or Vaca, MoHW will be informed, and that's where the master trigger is, and that's where it be activated. Once the operator activates this master trigger, all 7 sirens would be activated simultaneously at the same time, right? So There's also a backup trigger at the Ladyville Met Station, just in case the main trigger at MoHW fails. Then we would call the Met Station at Ladyville for them to activate their backup trigger, and then this should also activate all 7 stations at the same time. In the event that we activate the EWS and any one station does not or fails to activate, then these can also be activated manually at the site itself, right? So we'd have someone go out to that site and manually activate that siren so that residents in that area can be alerted, right? And basically it's a high-powered siren that would blare in the event of an emergency. Once we activate it, it would blare continuously. And so once residents of the area hear the siren, they should automatically assume that there's an emergency happening at either one or all 3 of the dams, and that's their cue to activate their emergency plans and get to a safe zone, which have been designated in each of these communities, right? And we'll get into that shortly. So this is a map showing where the sirens are located, right? So like I said, we have at the bottom of the screen, you see the MoHW Dam, then the Vaca Dam, followed by that is Black Rock is the first resort along the way. So we have a siren there. We have one at Chalk Creek, as I mentioned before, one in Cristo Rey, San Ignacio, Santa Familia, Bullet Tree, and Color Creek. Now, for those of you familiar with the area, you might ask, why do we have a siren at Bullet Tree and Color Creek? These are on the MoPan River, not on the Macal. But if you look at the map, there's an area of confluence where the Macal and the MoPan rivers meet, and it's at that point, then, if there should be flood waters coming down the Macal River, for instance, if there's a dam break at Chalet and all the water from the reservoir flows down, that would be a very, very huge volume of water coming down very quickly. And so when it hits that area where the 2 rivers meet, then the water would start, some would flow down and some would start backing up into the Mopan River, right? So it would cause extended flooding along the Mopan River as well. So that's why we include Bullet Tree and Color Creek villages in this early warning scheme. Right? And of course, we need to ensure that this our systems and even our procedures and emergency plans are effective if we ever have to call them into action, right? And hopefully we never have to, but if we ever have to activate these plans and these early warning system, we need to ensure that they function like a well-oiled machine and they do the job as required, right? So monthly, our technician goes out and does an inspection and maintenance of all the components of all the EWS systems, right? He provides a detailed report, which is forwarded to the DOE for them to verify that this inspection and maintenance has happened and the system is up and running. A part of this includes that we manually activate each siren individually during this maintenance exercise. So residents of the areas would, they might recall hearing the siren blare for a split second. It's only basically a quick flip of the switch on and off. Once we hear that burst, that burst of the siren, then we know it's functioning. So residents of the area that hear this every month, if it's a split second activation, a split second burst, then it's nothing to be concerned about. That's just the routine maintenance happening and the testing. When you should be concerned if you hear the siren activate and it doesn't stop, right? That's when you should assume that there's an emergency happening. As I mentioned before, we work very closely with NEMO and the DOE. In the event of a dam break or a dam failure, and with all the water coming downstream, it will then become a public emergency. So while we have our internal emergency plan, we have to work very closely with NEMO to ensure that our plans dovetail smoothly with NEMO's public emergency plans, right? So that there's no confusion or nothing is lost in translation when we're actually having to execute a public emergency response, right? So in order for us to be able to work, to be able to coordinate on that level, we have to practice, right? So a part of one of the conditions of the ECP is that we have to hold drills in coordination with NEMO to test the functionality of our procedures, right? And ensure that the procedures are functioning as they should, and they reflect accurately what the conditions on the ground are, right? And to ensure that, of course, whoever is executing these procedures, they're familiar with and up to date, and they have it fresh in their minds as to what the responsibilities are and what actions need to be taken during an emergency, right? So, and these drills can take various forms, right? So, we did a drill a couple of years ago, a full scale, we call a full scale drill, which involved activating the public emergency agencies like the police, the the ambulance services in our area in Spanish Lookout. We activated, I think the fire department was also activated. The traffic department was called into action to redirect traffic from areas that would expect to be flooded during an actual emergency. We even involved the participation of the general public in the form of schools and businesses downtown San Ignacio that we asked to participate voluntarily during this drill. In terms of, for the schools, for instance, we measured the response time and how quickly and smoothly they were able to direct the students to the safe zone in their area, right? So we can do full-scale drills. We also have done tabletop exercises, which is basically just running through the motions of the procedures themselves and ensuring that everybody's familiar with the procedure and trying to identify any gaps in those procedures as we review and review the procedures and during the tabletop exercises, right? So it won't always be a full-scale drill, so we do it annually, but the public sometimes the public may not know that we have done the drill because it was probably a desktop exercise we did that year, but we try to do a full scale every 3 to 5 years. We do a full scale drill to ensure that the actual response itself is well coordinated on the ground. Right. So this is a summary of what would happen in the event of a dam emergency, right? As I said, the communications will be channeled through our MoHW control room. Once they verify that there has been an actual dam breach or a dam failure is developing, then they would immediately activate the alarm sequence, push the remote trigger to activate all the sirens. Then, of course, we have to, that operator would have to inform BECOL management or technical supervisors or CEO, as well as the BEL system control, because at that point, then BECOL would no longer be able to deliver power to BEL, so BEL would have to then source power from other sources in order to keep the lights on in the rest of the country, right? And of course, then we have to immediately notify NEMO, especially, so that they then activate their emergency and evacuation plans, and they coordinate with BECOL as to, and in order to manage this emergency at the time, right? So, like I said, part of the emergency plans require that we designate safe zones within each of these vulnerable communities. So residents of the area would be familiar with signs like this, which basically is directing them to the nearest safe zone in their particular area. Some villages and of course San Ignacio and Santa Elena Town have various safe zones, right, spread out across the municipalities to ensure that people living in different areas can safely find and arrive at these safe zones within the allotted time, because of course once the water has breached the Chaleo Dam or any of the dams, there'll be limited time to get to a safe area which is outside of the flood zones or the projected flood zones, right? So once you get to one of these areas, one of the safe zones, you'll see a large sign like this indicating that you're now in a safe zone, and the flood waters are not expected to reach. And this is one of the first points that NEMO would start to look for people needing evacuation and so on. Right. So a very thorough study a flood study was conducted after the Chaleo Dam was built. It was conducted to determine what areas would be flooded in the event that the Chaleo Dam would fail, right? And what would be the level of water, how quickly it would reach, how quickly it would start to recede, and so on. This study was updated 2 years ago, I believe, in 2019, in order to take into account better technology that's available now. Much better GIS data that would allow us to, and it did allow us to have a much more accurate flood study conducted. So we now have a more accurate picture of when the flood waters would reach, what would be the depth of the waters, the spread of the flood waters, and so on, right? So basically, for most downstream areas up to about San Ignacio town, maximum evacuation time would be 2 to 4 hours, depending on your location, right? So a location like Chalk Creek or Black Rock, at most it would have, I'd say, about 2 hours to evacuate before the flood waters start to arrive. Cristo Rey, San Ignacio town, Bullet Tree, and so on would have about 3 to 4 hours to get to a safe zone, right? And you have to remember that if we would have any of the dams would fail and all that water would start flowing downstream, it wouldn't be like a normal flood, right? A normal flood during a tropical storm or other natural event would take it would take hours, even days, to build up and for the flood waters to get to a level where it starts to become dangerous, right? So you have a lot of advance warning when it comes to tropical storms and so on. We can actually see the storm approaching and all that, right? You expect the flood waters, but in a dam break scenario, it's a completely unexpected emergency event where the waters are now flowing downstream very quickly, and a large volume of water at that. So time would be very limited, right? So it's your family plan then should be that simply find your family members. If you can alert your neighbors or other family members living close by, and try to get to the nearest safe zone as quickly as possible, right? Forget material things, forget TV, sofa, whatever. It's not time to think about saving those things. It's basically your life you're trying to preserve at that point, right? And so this is one of the maps that was generated by the flood study. And this is showing the arrival time of the flood waters based on your zone or the area in which you live. Right. So like I mentioned, a dam breach at Chaleo, of course, be immediate. The immediate areas immediately downstream of Chaleo would be flooded almost immediately. MoHW Dam, be less than an hour for the flood waters to reach there. Vaca Dam, between 1 and 2 hours. Cristo Rey would have maximum 3 hours to evacuate and reach a safe zone. People living in San Ignacio would have about between 3 and 4 hours to get to their safe zone. Bullet Tree, 4 to 5 hours. That's the Esperanza area, just after San Ignacio, would have between 4 and 7 hours. Then after that, by that time, NEMO is in full response mode, and most people would already be aware of the flood waters coming downstream, right? After a couple of hours, everybody would know that there's an emergency happening. So, while we're not discounting the threat to the other areas after San Ignacio, we were more concerned with these areas between Chaleo and San Ignacio because those are the ones closest to the facilities that would be affected a lot sooner than other areas, right? So it's more critical. We consider them to be more critical in terms of alerting the residents living in these areas. Right. So again, this is just a sample of one of the flood maps generated by the flood modeling done for the flood study. And it gives you very detailed information when it comes to the water levels, the time of arrival of the flood wave, the peak of the flood wave, right? So if you look at, for instance, if you look at the little box at the bottom of the screen, it's telling you several things, right? It's telling you when the flood wave would arrive at San Ignacio. It would be around 3.5 hours, 3.5 hours, right? It's when we should expect to see the first indications of the flood waters reaching San Ignacio area. And then it would peak, meaning that it would reach its highest levels. After about 5 hours, the water would reach its highest level. And that highest level would be during a sunny day breach, which it would be 14 meters. And during a probable maximum flood plus a dam breach will be 18 meters. Just allow me to explain, I'll explain a little bit about the sunny day breach and the probable maximum flood, right? So the flood study looks at two scenarios. It looks at a sunny day breach, meaning that maybe the height of the dry season, maybe around March, April, May. There's no rain, no storm, nothing like that. It's just maybe we have a major earthquake in one of our neighboring countries, which sends a very strong aftershock or tremor our way, which could cause a shifting of one of the sections of the dam and leading to a eventual dam failure, right? That's what we call a sunny day breach. A PMF plus breach. PMF means probable maximum flood, which is we're looking at a 500-year flood event. So, which would then cause the reservoir Chaleo to become to breach its design capacity, basically, go above its design capacity, and then cause a failure of the Chaleo Dam, right? That is an entirely different scenario because then the river would have already been flooded. We already have major flooding due to the tropical storm event or the hurricane event, whatever it might be, the 500-year event, 500-year storm event would have already caused major flooding. And then on top of that, the Chaleo Dam fails, bringing an additional volume of water on top of that natural flood waters, right? So there's two scenarios we look at, and we have this data available for both scenarios, right? So during a sunny day breach, the maximum height in San Ignacio of the water would be about 14 meters off the ground. During a probable maximum flood plus a breach of the dam, it would be about 18 meters, right? So anywhere between so it'd be about a 4-meter difference, right? About a 12-foot difference between a sunny day and a probable maximum flood event, right? And if you look at the map itself, the areas in red, outlined in red, is the sunny day failure, and the area in blue is the probable maximum flood plus a breach of the dam. So you'd see the difference in terms of how the water spreads out, right? There's a lot more spreading out when you have the storm event plus a breach of the dam. There's a lot more water coming, being added to the flood waters that are already present, right? During a sunny day event, the areas outlined in red, that's showing only the waters that were contained within the Chaleo Reservoir, now flowing downstream and entering the San Ignacio area, right? So you can see the difference. So if you look at, like I said, the area where the Mopan and the Macal rivers meet, that's where you would have this backing up and this spreading out effect happening, right? So you see that whole area almost like a triangle between San Ignacio and Bolitria and Santa Familia, where some major flooding would happen. Right, so that's the, in a nutshell, that's the information we have for the public in terms of being prepared for a dam emergency, a dam failure, basically, right? Looking at what safeguards we have in place to try to prevent a dam failure. But in the event of an emergency, then we do have things in place that would help to preserve life, maybe not so much property, but the main objective then would be to save lives, right? So we have the procedures in place. We work as closely as possible with NEMO, so that we're both on the same page when it comes to if we ever have to respond to a dam failure emergency. All right, so we can move on to the Mercury-in-fish.
Alonzo, can I just have a little interjection at this point?
Yeah, sure.
I'd like to remind the general public, I take this opportunity to remind the general public that so far we have presented, Ms. Alonzo has presented on the water quality, as well as the emergency preparedness aspects associated with the reporting requirements for this quarter. We are here tonight. Whilst we are legally mandated, we also would like to hear from the general public. Is there any clarification? Is the information being transmitted clearly to you? Do you have any questions? Do you have any comments? This is the opportunity for you to make those questions, send in those comments. You can use the comment box. Anything that has sparked your interest, anything that you feel needs to be clarified, please send in your questions so that then we could start gathering up and then we could have them addressed in the comment and answer section. Please also feel free to direct any questions to the Department of the Environment. We know that the public session does involve representation from NEMO and Ministry of Health. Please send those questions, even though they're not online participating with us. We would forward those questions and comments to the pertinent agency, and we would make sure that you get a response. But in so doing, for questions for NEMO and Ministry of Health that are not present with us today, unfortunately, please provide us with your email so that we could get those questions and answers out to you. We do urge you to take this opportunity. We do this every quarter. Please send in your questions. There's no question, that is too complicated for us, or no question that is too simple for us. It's for you, the general public, to understand and appreciate some of the environmental issues associated with the hydroelectrical scheme that BECOL has on the river, and the measures and activities that are being undertaken. And again, for you to be engaged and involved in all of what is incorporates the activities of BECOL on the Macal River. So I'm looking forward to some of your questions, some of your comments. For example, you've mentioned, Mr. Alonzo mentioned in the early warning system that there are monthly inspections. I just like to inform the general public, particularly those in the communities of direct influence, that on June 24th, community members from these communities who form part of the Public Participation Committee will have the opportunity to be present with us whilst we do these inspections so that they could verify and validate what is being presented here. And if you have questions, you can also send those questions to your community leaders. We know that the chairpersons from the villages do participate in these Public Participation Committee meetings, so that's another forum for you to get your questions to us, and then we can get some responses and clarifications to you. Again, it is important. The importance of these sessions is for you, the general public, to be well informed and kept up to date. So I'm looking forward to your active participation tonight and in future activities. So at this point, we'll ask Mr. Alonzo to continue with the Mercury-in-fish presentation, whilst all our viewers and listeners articulate their questions, comment, and send them to us. We appreciate those, and we're looking forward to actively engage with you in the comments and question sessions. Mr. Alonzo, I return and provide you the platform to continue with this presentation. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mr. Franco. Let me share my screen again. All right, so we now move on to the other major topic, which is Mercury-in-fish monitoring. Okay. All right, so as I mentioned, we do the Mercury-in-fish sampling and testing once a year, every year. Since 2016, BECOL voluntarily extended the sampling to include other rivers of Belize. So initially, we were only doing Chalillo, Guacamayo Bridge, Cristo Rey Village, Vaca Dam upstream, and Vaca Dam downstream, collecting samples of fishes from these different areas and sending them for testing for mercury. Since 2016, we started sampling in Santa Familia Village, Cala Creek, Benque Viejo Town, Iguana Creek Bridge, at Roaring Creek Village, Burrell Boom. And we also included as comparisons, for comparison purposes, we took samples, or we started taking samples from the New River and Orange Rock Town, just upstream of Tower Hill. And also we take a sample from the Rio Grande down south near Big Falls Village, right? To basically to compare and see, because mercury is a naturally occurring element, right? There's always a background level of mercury in most ecological systems, right? As a matter of fact, prior to the construction of the Chalillo Dam, an environmental impact assessment was conducted, as well as PAHO also conducted some surveys which showed that there were already some elevated levels of mercury in some species of fish, right? And one of them being the bay snook, which is one of the more popular fish that are consumed from the Macal River, right? So even before the Chalillo Dam was constructed, these studies from the EIA and the studies done by PAHO were showing levels that were above the 0.5 milligram per kilogram for these fish, which is the 0.5 milligram basically is the safe level, what is considered by the WHO, the World Health Organization, to be the safe consumption level for mercury in fish tissue, right? So we need to keep in mind that there have always been background levels of mercury. The dam, the activities of the dam or the reservoir created by the dams, of course, added to these background levels, but we have to look at the data in relation to the levels that were already present as well, right? So some of the fish, these are some of the fish we sample, or we managed to sample in the Macal River. Not all of them are of importance as it pertains to human consumption. A lot of them are very small fish that most people don't consume. We have some of the more popular ones that are consumed though, like the botasé, the tilapia, the blue-eye catfish, and of course the bay snook, right? The bay snook is, as from what we have gathered in most of the communities, this is the most popular fish that is consumed. So we tend to pay a little bit more particular attention to these species, simply because they are consumed a lot more than the other species that are not very much are not of much value when it comes to consumption or even commercial purposes, right? So subsequent to analyzing the data which we've been collecting since roughly about 2007 to up to last year, the mercury levels in the fish from the Macal River have shown a general decreasing trend over the years, right? Like I said, when it comes to these samplings, the actual or the raw data would fluctuate. It might be higher this year, lower next year, and so on. However, if you look at the long-term trend, which would be over a period of 10 years or more in this case, you can see where, despite those fluctuations in individual years, the trend is showing a general decrease from 2007 up to 2020, right? So what that is telling us is that the mercury levels are returning back to what was a normal level before the dams were built, right? And so we don't expect the mercury to go to zero, because it was never at zero, but we do expect it to eventually get back to what was the normal background level before the construction of the dams. And that's exactly what we're seeing over the years. With respect to the Upper Belize River, the Mopan River, the New River, and the Rio Grande, these show fluctuating levels as well since we started to monitor these 5 years ago. However, we still need to gather more data in order to make to come to a confident conclusion when it comes to the levels of mercury in these rivers, right? We have data for about 5 years, but like I said, they fluctuate a lot. So in order to see a more clearly defined trend, we need to gather data for these rivers for at least another few years. The New River in particular is showing significantly higher levels of mercury during last year, right? And we'll look at that shortly. We for clarity and for ease of reference, and for ease of comparison, we are showing data from 2016 to 2020 on these graphs, right? Which show that for the Chaleo Dam site, which we call Site A, most of the species of fish, and the different colors of line are different species of fish, right? And the straight red line around the middle of the graph is the upper limit or the upper safe level, right? So we don't want to see any data points above that line, because once they're above that line, it means that they're above the safe limit for consumption, right? So if you look at the Chaleo Dam area, for the most part, most of the species have been below the safe consumption level, right? Except in 2019 and 2020, where we had the Botasé, I think it is, that was at or above the safe level, right? All the others were below during the past 5 years. Guacamayo Bridge site, similarly, for the past 5 years, most of the samples have shown levels well below the 0.5 milligram per kilogram. Crystal Ray site, again, there's a similar trend, except for the Petenia splendida, which is the bay snook, right? The bay snook in 2019 and 2020 showed a spike in the levels from previously being below the safe consumption level. They went above in 2019, and you see a little bit of a decrease in 2020, but still above 0.5. Vaca Dam, downstream Vaca Dam site, which is Site E. We have a little bit more fluctuation here, right? You can see in 2016, we had at least 3 species that were well above 0.5. And we had another couple species that were below. One of the species that is of particular interest, the Petenia splendida, otherwise known as the bay snook. The red line is what we're more concerned with. So we had a high level of mercury in the bay snook in 2016. Levels dropped in 2017, 2018. It spiked a little bit in 2019, but remained below 0.5 during last year. Santa Familia site. We have most of these samples have been below 0.5 during the past 5 years, except again for the bay snook. The bay snook seems to be the delinquent here, right? Always having higher levels of mercury in the bay snook over the years. Again, fluctuating, but from time to time spiking above the 0.5 milligram per kilogram. Color Creek, again on the Mopan River. Most of the samples have been below, except for the bay snook again, which in 2016 was above. It went below for 2017, 18, and 19, and spiked again last year, right? So again, these individual spikes are of concern. However, we also have to look at the bigger picture, and in the grander scheme of things, the trend is still a generally decreasing trend for all of the species of fish, right? The Benqueviejo site, again, most of them were below 0.5, except for a couple of species in 2017. We had the blue-eye catfish. and we had the tilapia. Yeah, the tilapia was also slightly above 0.5 in 2017. In 2020, we have the bay snook spiked a little bit above 0.5. Everything else was below. Iguana Creek, we haven't had much issues there. All of the species have generally been below 0.5. We had, except for the, that would be the Botassi, I believe, was right at 0.5 in 2016, but then went below and remained below for the next 4 years, right? And all the other species have been below 0.5 at Iguana Creek. Roaring Creek, which is a little bit more downstream now, closer to Belmopan, have most of the species being well below. The bay snook has been right at the borderline for a couple of years. So again, the bay snook is a species we're really keeping an eye on. Coral boom, we had most of the, from 2016 to 2019, we had most of the species of fish well below 0.5. In 2020, there was a general spike for all the species. A couple of them went above 0.5 during last year, right? And that again included the bay snook, which is the green line. Bay snook and the Botassi. New River now, which is, of course, is not affected by the dams any at all. There's no dam on the New River. So what we're looking at here is strictly environmental levels or probably being affected by human activity as well. I would hazard to guess that they are being affected by human activities because the mercury levels in the New River have been above 0.5. Well, in 2016, they dipped during the next 3 years and then spiked again last year. Right? In some cases, for the bay snook again in the river, it spiked more than 3 times the safe consumption level, right? So it's something that maybe the GOB needs to keep an eye on. Big Falls we consider to be more of a pristine river compared to the Macal or even the New River, right? So we kind of use this as a reference point for background levels of mercury. So as expected, most of the samples were well below 0.5. A lot of them were close to, close to zero. Very, very negligible amounts of mercury between 2016 and 2019. For some reason in 2020, all of them spiked with a few 3 species being above 0.5, right? So again, this is one data set, and it's difficult to make conclusions based on one data set, right? So we'll have to keep monitoring this in order to be able to draw a more confident conclusion when it comes to the mercury levels in fish from the Rio Grande. Right. Mercury is one of the bigger issues because mercury can have a lot of physiological and neurological effects on the human anatomy, right? It can affect adults, it can affect children, it can affect even the fetus in a pregnant woman carrying a child, right? So it causes things like it affects your mental capabilities. It can cause even mental and physical disabilities in a fetus. It can lead to loss of vision, loss of muscle coordination, and a lot of other neurological effects, right? It basically affects your nervous system mainly. So once it accumulates to a high enough level within your body, right, your tissues, and within your system. So, and the way it works is that the smaller fish, all the fish would be exposed to the mercury in the water column. However, as how the food chain operates, right? A small fish is eaten by a medium-sized fish, and then the mercury in that small fish bioaccumulates in the medium-sized fish. Then a larger fish comes along and eats 2 or 3 medium-sized fish, and that further bioaccumulates in that larger fish. So the general idea or the general trend is that the bigger the fish, the more mercury it's likely to have, right? Even and it's not something confined to dam activities or hydroelectric activities. You have, even in the ocean, right? You have certain fish are known to have very high levels of mercury, such as the barracuda, the sharks, tuna, which can grow to very large sizes. Right? Even the canned tuna you buy in the store, which comes from, of course, the tuna they catch in the ocean. These tend to have very high levels of mercury. So it's not advisable to eat even canned tuna on a regular basis, right? Shark and other large fish, it's not advisable to eat them on a regular basis, right? But we need fish in our diet. Fish provide a lot of nutrients, a lot of essential amino acids and proteins and so on that our organism needs. And so if we can't eat fish, then what are we to do? So the Ministry of Health recommends that there are certain foods that can replace fish in our diet when we have to, right? Ideally, we wouldn't want to have to replace fish, but if we have to, then for our particular situation here in the Cayo district, we can eat fish from other locations in the country that may not be subject to these higher mercury levels. We have certain replacement foods such as local chicken that is very high in the omega-3 acids that fish provide. Pumpkin seed, locally known as pepitos, right? Sesame seed, otherwise known as wangla. Cashew nuts, avocados, spinach, all of these have very high levels of omega-3 acids that is one of the key nutrients that fish provides for us, right? You can also use oils from different sources such as flaxseed oil, canola oil, corn oil, olive oil, soybean oil. All of these also provide some of the same nutrients that we find in fish, right? So, you know, mercury is an issue when it comes, like I mentioned, it's an issue when it comes to dams anywhere you are in the world, and you know, while we need the hydroelectric power to keep the lights on in our homes, in our businesses, charge our phones to basically make life livable, we need electricity. We also have to be aware that, as with any human development, there will be negative effects that need to be managed, right? And that the important word there is that we need to manage it, right? In some cases, we will not be able to eliminate the negative effects entirely, but if we manage it responsibly, we can ensure that we don't we minimize the negative or the detrimental effects on the environment and as well as on human health, right? So that's the end of my presentation, and we now segue into the questions and comment section, which I will now hand over to Mr. Franco.
Thanks, Mr. Alonso. So we're moving over to the question and comment session. I'm gonna see what questions have been made available to us so that we could answer. Fortunately, at this point, I see no questions. I guess, Mr. Alonso, you did a very good job in explaining. Oh, here's a question. It's coming in. Just 1 second. Oh, it's a comment. Okay, the comment says it's very professional, honest, transparent report. Thank you, GOB, educators, people. It's all that is needed. So thanks for that good comment. We try our best. We make sure that we are available here to answer, to make the presentations on the reporting requirements of BECOL. Again, it's a legal requirement. But again, it's always a pleasure for us to be out here educating, informing the people, both from behalf of the Department of the Environment, on behalf of BECOL, and our other environmental agencies and government departments, including NEMO and the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health plays a very key role in regards to the last presentation that Mr. Alonso gave in Mercury-in-fish survey. We're currently engaged with BECOL in doing a survey, so we would see people, interviewers coming into your community, as we are currently doing a fish consumption survey as we seek to improve on the reporting requirements for this activity. So we will look forward to share this for your participation. Mr. Alonso, would you mind to comment on what the communities and community members would be expecting from BECOL in regards to this fish consumption survey, just to give us a brief update so that the community members, when they see the interviewers come about, they know what it is and they can actively participate and engage. Mr. Alonso.
Yeah, sure, Mr. Franco. Yes, so this year we're conducting an additional survey apart from the usual Mercury-in-fish sampling. It's a survey basically to determine what is the consumption pattern of the residents living in these communities when it comes to fish, or fish from the Macal River, or fish in general, right? We're trying to find out, first of all, the amount of fish they actually consume, the types of fish, where they source their fish from, in order to determine or make a better determination as to the level of risk that these communities are facing when it comes to mercury, right? Ingestion of mercury. This survey, I think, was done initially at the start of this all these environmental studies. It'll be probably more than 10 years ago. So we're basically doing an update to see if consumption patterns have changed or they remain the same. And this would then allow us to make better use of our resources in terms of focusing more on the fish that are actually consumed by residents in these areas, and maybe not entirely discounting, but again, focusing the resources more on these fish that are actually consumed, and as opposed to the smaller fish that may not have any consumption value. However, they do still play an ecological role, so we cannot discount them entirely. But when it comes to human health, there are some species of fish that really they're not consumed any at all. So it's really not a cause for concern any at all. And we can then focus our resources, financial and otherwise, on testing the species that are actually being consumed by the population, right? So, and in addition to that, the survey will also capture the people that are selling the fish, right? The fish sellers, that we try to see where they're sourcing their fish, which species of fish are being being bought by the population more, what are the more popular fishes, quantities that are being bought, and so on and so forth, right? So you will see very shortly interviewers going around in San Ignacio, maybe at Market Day, as well as to individual homes in the villages and in San Ignacio, Santa Elena, to basically ask you a few questions about your consumption patterns when it comes to fish, right? How much fish you consume and the types of fish and how often, if everyone in your home consumes it, and so on and so forth. So, as Mr. Franco said, we appreciate your honest responses so that we can better inform our activities and bring to you, the public, much better informed reports and data and better information for you to be guided, right?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Alonso, for that update. I don't see any other questions, comments coming in. Again, I'll take this opportunity to highlight the importance of the participation, especially of the community members within the direct influence of the hydroelectric scheme. Those being, again, Cristo Rey, San Ignacio, Santa Elena, Bully Tree, Santa Familia, Cala Creek. We do appreciate, and we know that you're out there, you're listening to us. Again, we will be back here in about 3 months' time. We will share more additional updated information. We should be getting some water quality data, some updated data, so we will have those available for you. We look forward then to your participation, and please be reminded, this is something active and current. Do not or use the opportunity at any time, and feel free to contact both the Department of the Environment, BECOL. If you have any questions, if for some reason you are reluctant to ask your questions or pass comments, you can always email us, and we would respond to you in regards to your questions or your comments, and we would also forward those to any relevant agency. So we do want to inform the public that we have an open door policy as it pertains to addressing any environmental concerns that you may have, or any suggestions for improving on the data collection, any queries that you have, clarifications that you need, because at the end of the day, you know, environmental protection is everybody's business. So it's upon us, all as Belizeans, to ensure that our environment is maintained the healthiest possible. Well, being that there's no other questions, Mr. Alonso, first of all, I'd like to thank you for taking out the time tonight, you know, to be here with us and sharing this valuable information with the general public. We'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all those who have made this public session a success, or behind the scenes people from the press office who are here working with us diligently, even at this hour. Other officers from the Department of the Environment who also coordinated and are currently online facilitating the session. I'd like to then thank all those who participated, who looked in, taking your time tonight. I know you were having your dinner, you have a nice dinner, but you invited us into your house. We appreciate your time taken out to participate, and we look forward to your participation in the next quarter virtual meeting, and we will share additional information with you. Again, we look for improved participation. Should you have any comments, for example, today we did a session at 7 p.m. based on feedback we got from the community members. So should there be any suggestion, comments for improvement, we'd also like to welcome those as we seek to improve in how we engage the community to make sure that, you know, there's full participation from the general community. Once again, thanks everyone for being with us. Enjoy your evening. You know, if you haven't had dinner, please take this opportunity to have a dinner, get some rest. See you next time. Thanks.